What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. If you're not interested in the combination, I've got some links down in the description for you, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. It was 1994 in sunny Orange County, California, when 50-year-old Linda Curry found herself fighting for her life. Struck down with a mysterious combination of symptoms that had even the most seasoned medical professionals stumped. As hard as it was to admit, it was obvious to everyone around Linda that she didn't have much time left. But little did she or her family or her friends know that the truth of her condition, in actuality, was far more disturbing than any naturally occurring medical condition possibly could have been. This is the story of how a brilliant mind thought that he had orchestrated the perfect murder. For 16 years, Paul Curry walked free. He truly believed that he had pulled off the perfect crime. But sometimes, and arguably most of the time, even the smartest criminals make the dumbest mistakes. This is the story of the devastating and confusing death of Linda Curry. A story that proves that even the brightest minds can't outsmart justice forever. This case was requested by a wonderful subscriber named Oz, so thank you so much to Oz for making this video possible. Alright, so Orange County, California. Let's talk about it. Orange County, California, or more commonly referred to as the OC, is a vibrant coastal region nestled between Los Angeles, California, and San Diego. With a current population of approximately 3.2 million people, the OC is the third most populous county in California and the sixth most populous county in the US as a whole. It spans over roughly 793 square miles of diverse landscape with pristine coastline and beautiful inland valleys. And this beautiful, picturesque slice of paradise will serve as the stunning backdrop for today's otherwise very grim story. Linda Lee Kilgore was born on February 18th, 1944 in Los Angeles, California, to her parents Guy and Mary Jane Kilgore. She was the second born of the couple's two daughters. Obviously, that means she had one older sister. And while I couldn't find too terribly much about Linda's upbringing and about her life growing up, actually I couldn't find anything about it, what I can tell you is that she was the absolute epitome of what I feel like a person means when they say California girl. She was blonde, she was tan, she was tall, she was gorgeous. So not only did she hit the genetic frickin' lottery, but Linda also seems like she was just a genuinely amazing person, as much so inside as she was out. When asked to describe Linda, almost all of her friends seemed to say all of the same sorts of things. She was kind, she was warm, she was friendly, she was generous. Truly, in researching who Linda was, I did not come across a single person who had a single bad thing to say about her. She just seems like she had all the best qualities that a person could possibly have. And then some. She was pretty, she was funny, she was smart, she was athletic, she loved food and shopping, she loved fashion. Looking back, a friend of Linda's mentioned that she was always impeccably dressed. She was always perfectly coordinated, from her blouses to her shoes to her jewelry to her nails. Linda always looked friggin' show-stopping. But don't take that and get it twisted. Sure, she may have been like a blonde bombshell, but she was certainly not your stereotypical dumb blonde. And I can say that, because I'm a dumb blonde. However, Linda certainly was not. Linda graduated high school in the early 1960s, and while I couldn't find any information on where or if she attended college, one thing I can tell you for sure is that Linda was an incredibly driven and an incredibly ambitious woman. Glass ceiling? She never heard of it. She knew that wherever she ended up, she was going to work her ass off, she was going to get ahead, and she was going to make something of herself. And that's exactly what she went on to do. Linda's career officially began when she accepted an entry-level administrative position at Southern California's San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, an establishment that, as the name suggests, was a nuclear power plant located in San Clemente, California, owned by the larger umbrella company of Southern California Edison. Throughout her time working at San Onofre, Linda worked hard, she proved herself, she proved her worth, and eventually she worked her way all the way up to a high-powered corporate executive position. So by Linda's late 30s, early 40s, I'd say, she had made quite a life for herself. She was making good money. She had bought herself a beautiful home. She had great benefits through work. She had an incredible group of friends. She was close with her family, particularly her sister and her niece. Like I said, Linda was living very comfortably. The only thing in Linda's life that perhaps some people might view her as unfortunate for was that she hadn't quite been as successful romantically as she had been professionally. Now, that's not to say that, one, if you're single, you're not successful, but it's also not to say that Linda did not put effort into that part of her life. Quite the opposite, actually. Linda was married and divorced 2 separate times, and then outside of those marriages, she had at least 2 other very serious relationships. However, obviously, both of those ultimately had come to an end, once again rendering Linda single. That said, though, Linda always seemed to remain in touch with and to remain on good terms with these men. As previously stated, apparently, even if she had dumped your ass, there was just no way that anyone could seem to dislike Linda. She was simply that great of a person. But despite the fact that she was a self-proclaimed hopeless romantic, something just always seemed to get in the way of Linda finding her Prince Charming. In fact, she was actually pretty much ready to throw in the towel on dating and on men and marriage as a whole. But as we have discussed here before on this channel, love has a silly little way of popping up in your life almost exactly when you stop looking for it. And that was exactly what happened to Linda in 1989 when a young man named Paul Curry walked into her life. Paul was quite literally a nuclear engineer who'd recently taken on a job at San Onofre as a safety consultant. Now, Paul was about 12 years Linda's junior. He was 33 and she was 45 when they met. But putting that aside, Linda was almost immediately taken with Paul. Not only did she find him physically attractive, but she also felt as though he was a really good match for her intellectually as well. Like I said, homeboy was a whole-ass nuclear engineer. Just from the name alone, you can tell that someone has to be very smart to have that job. And as if that wasn't enticing enough to Linda, on top of that, Paul was musically talented. He was a good cook. He was a member of Mensa, so he had a way above average IQ. He was so smart that he had actually won over $20,000 on Jeopardy just a couple of months prior to meeting Linda. I mean, as far as Linda was concerned, this man, he was the total package. And much to her surprise and delight, Paul seemed to be just as interested in getting to know Linda as Linda was in getting to know Paul. These two quickly found themselves smitten with one another, and before they knew it, they were in a full-blown relationship, and said relationship seemed like it was getting pretty serious pretty fast. Paul very quickly moved in with Linda, and just as quickly, he also began to reap the benefits of dating someone that was as well established as Linda was. However, while Linda seemed perfectly comfortable carrying on the lion's share of the couple's financial burdens, some of her family and friends weren't as understanding of Paul as she seemed to be. For starters, them big old brains of Paul's that Lynn had been so very attracted to. You know, she had loved the fact that he seemed to know just at least little tidbits about pretty much anything that anyone ever brought up. Yeah, to other people, that shit came off as arrogant and egotistical. In the aftermath of this case, a lot of people who knew Paul have gone on to say that he very much gave off the air that he was smarter than you, that he was better than you, and that he wanted you to know that he knew those things. He was the type of person that would frequently and without hesitation correct anyone on anything at any time. And sure, while maybe his wording was nice, relatively speaking, this was still a quality about Paul that tended to rub people the wrong way. You know, if you're just out to dinner with your friends and you're just shooting the shit and having a good time, you don't want your grammar corrected or something like that. It's annoying and it ruins the vibe. But don't worry, because Paul's personality flaws, they did not end there. No, ma'am. Some of Linda's family members have stated in interviews since all this went down that Paul never really seemed all that interested in getting to know them or getting to know Linda's friends or creating any sort of lasting bonds with any of them. He didn't seem to care enough to try to enmesh himself with those closest to her, like you might imagine, or at the very least hope, that a partner would. But even though some of these traits really did rub Linda's friends and family the wrong way, overall, they really just tried to bite their tongue as much as they could because as far as they could see, Linda was happy and Paul was absolutely head over heels in love with her. This man positively doted on her. At least that's the way it seemed to everyone else. He was always cooking her these gourmet dinners or drawing her these beautiful, elaborate bubble baths. He also always called her by these adorable little pet names. He clearly was not embarrassed or emasculated to be overly loving or overly affectionate with her in front of other people. So, for the most part, those closest to Linda, they kept their reservations about Paul to themselves, and instead they opted to sit back and just allow Linda to be happy. Linda and Paul would ultimately go on to get married. They tied the knot on September 12th, 1992 in Vegas, still appearing to those around them to be this perfect, deeply in love, just dream couple. And while for the most part, Linda did still feel that way about Paul, there was definitely one thing about her new husband that, I don't know, I guess it confused her. It took her by surprise. And that was that despite now being married, unified, brought together by God as man and wife, for some reason, despite that fact, Paul was still very closed off, I guess you could say, when it came to being intimate with Linda. Sure, they were loving and they got along great, so it would certainly appear to anyone in passing that they were madly in love. However, according to Linda's best friend, they just weren't super passionate. They weren't hot and heavy in the bedroom. And I mean, that's fine, I guess, to each their own. Doesn't sound fun to me, but everybody's different. And if that was the life that they were both anticipating for marriage, that would be one thing, right? If you're both happy, if you're both content, that's fine. However, according to Linda's friend, this was not something that Linda was happy with. In fact, Paul's lack of interest in sassy time, it really bothered Linda. And I can totally understand that because as a woman, especially in the 90s, Jesus, once you were past 32, you were considered an old spinster. So I can only imagine that being married to this man who was so much younger than her, who then went on to show zero interest in throwing down in the sack, I'm sure that would make a lot of women in Linda's position feel insecure. And that was the exact effect that it had on her. She was actually so uncomfortable and so insecure in her marriage at this point that she invited a friend of hers to stay with her and Paul for a couple of weeks because she started to feel like he actually might not even love her at all. She wanted this friend to stay with them and to observe how they interacted and observe how Paul treated her and I guess just kind of try to vibe it out to see if it seemed like Paul was phoning it in their relationship or if he truly seemed to be happy. And her friend did end up agreeing to do this, but while she was staying with them, all she saw was Paul cooking for Linda and cleaning for Linda and running baths for Linda every night. So when the women finally got to a point where they got to debrief on everything, Linda's friend was like, girl, he is crazy about you. She was genuinely confused about what Linda had been so worried about. She went so far as to tell Linda that she would kill for a man that did half as much for her as Paul did for Linda. After seeing everything that she had while staying with the couple, she genuinely did not believe for even a second that Linda had anything to worry about within her marriage. However, little did anyone know that the problems within Paul and Linda's marriage, they were just starting to come to the surface. Obviously, we know about the intimacy thing. That was definitely a glaring issue. However, the next thing that came up really took Linda by surprise, and that was the issue of money. Now, theoretically, you wouldn't think that two high-level employees working at a nuclear power plant would ever have to worry about money, right? On paper, that seems like it would be the case. I think with their combined salaries, Paul and Linda were bringing home something like $140,000 a year. And remember, this is the 90s we're talking about. So taking inflation into consideration, that'd actually be closer to the equivalent of $320,000 annually in today's money. No, they weren't like billionaires, but they certainly should have been bringing home enough each year to cover their bills and then to still be living beyond comfortably. Yet, somehow, inexplicably, that just was not the case. Somehow, now being married to Paul and having two incomes in the home, Linda felt as though she was struggling more now with money than she ever had when she was single. And actually, it ended up being completely by accident that Linda even found out just where their money truly was going. You see, completely unbeknownst to Linda, this was not Paul's first marriage. It also wasn't his second. Just like Paul was Linda's third husband, Linda was Paul's third wife. Yes, prior to meeting and marrying Linda, Paul had also been married and divorced twice, something that I guess had just slipped his mind since apparently he'd forgotten to mention that to Linda. Oh, he also forgot to mention that he had a couple of kids too. Yeah, just another little nugget from his past that he didn't think it was important to fill her in on. Turns out though, it was very important because that's essentially where all of their money was disappearing off to. It was all going off to fulfill child support as well as alimony obligations of Paul's, all of which Linda had no idea about. She only found out about this because she happened to answer a call from Paul's ex that she was clearly not meant to. I guess Linda answered the phone and Paul's ex asked to speak to Paul, but Paul wasn't there, so Linda offered to take a message, and the message ended up being, when can I expect my alimony and my child support? Uh-oh. Girl, I cannot even imagine how pissed off Linda must have been in that moment. And rightfully so. Like, it is one thing, at least in my opinion, if you knowingly marry someone that has baggage like that. You know that you might be getting yourself into things that involve child support or alimony money. When you know about those things, you can take them into consideration and you can make the decision that is best for you at the time. But to have that information purposely withheld for you until it's just too late? Absolutely not. In my opinion, Linda would have been well within her rights to just tell her husband, like, sorry, but you got to pay that with your own money. Those are your responsibilities. They are your obligations, which you withheld from me. So sorry, pal. You're gonna have to figure that out. Ew, just to think that it was okay to take Linda's hard-earned money and to secretly funnel it out of their account and to his ex-wife. The lion, the witch, and the fucking audacity of this man. And girl, we are just getting started. The further and further that we get going through this case, the more and more you're gonna see that where Linda saw a husband and a partner in Paul, he simply saw a paycheck in Linda. Honestly, it is heartbreaking, the dichotomy between how these two viewed one another and how they handled their relationship. Case in point, just a couple of months into Paul and Linda's marriage, Paul told his new wife that he thought that they should probably take out a life insurance policy for her. And at first, Linda kind of thought like, this is what married people do. We'll get policies on each other and it'll cover us if anything were to happen to the other one. Seems like it would just make good sense. However, where shit got weird was when Paul corrected her. He told her that they didn't need a policy on him because he was so much younger than she was. Really, he thought it was only necessary to take a policy out on her. At least at that time. A policy to the tune of $1 million, might I add. So adjusting for inflation, we're talking like $2.27 million, for which he also demanded that he be the sole beneficiary.
You done lost your damn mind. When you get your damn mind, you call me.
Baby, these flags aren't red anymore. They are straight up crimson. Dare I say, they're creeping up on vermilion.
Vermilion. The color of carnal shame.
Now, ultimately, I do not believe that Linda ended up taking out the specific policy that Paul was pushing for. However, that's not to say that she didn't do anything, because she did still go out and she added Paul onto her mortgage and she added him onto her different life insurances that she'd already had prior to marrying him. She added him onto the title of her cars, onto her retirement plan. She did all of this for a man that could not even be honest with her about his past before they even got married. Yet, here he is, expecting her to jump through hoops on motherfucking hoops for his ass. I'm sorry, let me be fair. He did book a 3-night cruise for them to make up for the whole secret ex-wives and secret kid thing, so I guess you could say that he did something. Sadly, though, for both Linda and Paul, this romantic little getaway, it did not turn out to be the mini honeymoon type of trip that Paul had presented it as, or that Linda had hoped it would be. Nope. Instead, both she and Paul each ended up getting violently ill. Evidently, it appeared as though they had both contracted some sort of awful virus while they were aboard the ship, and it basically ruined their entire vacation. Now, initially, it seemed like maybe they had just gotten food poisoning, or perhaps they picked up like some sort of stomach bug that was making its way through the ship. However, Paul, he quickly recovered. But Linda, she did not appear to be as lucky. Her sickness dragged on for weeks with seemingly no end in sight. Linda was so sick that she and her friends actually started to worry that she had somehow unknowingly contracted hantavirus. I guess right around this same time, there was a massive hantavirus outbreak running rampant through like Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. And in turn, the coverage of this devastation was then running rampant through the news. Everybody was talking about it. Now, obviously, Paul and Linda, they were in California, which was not one of the like heavily afflicted states. But I think the fact in general that this shit was just popping off like one state away, it could have been enough to cause some understandable fear. And I don't know if you know this or not, but hantavirus, it's nothing to fuck around with. Back then, during the Four Corners outbreak specifically, I think you were looking at a mortality rate of 40% or higher. And that's pretty scary to think about. That said though, typically hantavirus is pretty rare. The virus typically spreads to humans through contact with infected rodent waste, so anything from droppings to urine to even saliva. And if left untreated, it can quickly progress to HPS, or hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, which is severe and even potentially fatal. The virus infects the blood vessels in your lungs, which makes them leak, ultimately causing your lungs to fill with fluid, which causes difficulty breathing, respiratory failure, and even heart problems. And what's really scary is that once these severe symptoms begin, if you're not treated quickly, death can occur as fast as within 24 to 48 hours. And this is terrifying because at first, the symptoms of hantavirus just come across as like flu-like symptoms, which is exactly what Linda was experiencing. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, sweating, abdominal pain. Her symptoms basically, they ran the gambit. So when she didn't get better after a couple of weeks, her friends and family began urging her to go to the hospital and to get herself checked out. I mean, Linda was so sick by this point that she could barely even get herself out of bed. She had lost a ton of weight, and I mean, she was tiny to begin with, but within just a couple of weeks, her friends said that she went from looking like a healthy and vibrant woman to like a frail old lady. It was really, really alarming to people when they would see Linda because she just looked like a shell of who she used to be. Thankfully, though, after a lot of urging from her friends and family, Linda did eventually check herself into Samaritan Medical Center in San Clemente, where she ended up being admitted for gastrointestinal problems. But after running all of their like typical preliminary tests, doctors were stumped. They could not find anything on Linda's tests or in her blood work or even in her medical history that would even begin to explain what was the cause of the symptoms she was experiencing. Honestly, all they ended up being able to do was to monitor her and to try to make her as comfortable as possible. You know, at least if she was in the hospital and things took a turn for the worst, help would literally be right there. But until that happened, or until she started getting better, really all they could do was to keep her hydrated and to keep a close eye on her. And thankfully, one nurse in particular had her very keen eyes on Linda. And because of this, she noticed something that someone else might have easily missed. One night, while she was checking in on Linda and taking her vitals and checking her IV bag, this nurse, her name was Sherry, she just so happened to notice that Linda's IV bag, it was looking really, really cloudy, which if you've ever had an IV, you know that that is absolutely not normal. IV bags typically contain a saline and dextrose solution that is colorless, and it is typically crystal clear. So when this nurse happened to look at the bag at just the right angle, under just the right lighting, she realized that it was cloudy, and she knew instantly that something was not right with this bag. But rather than cause a scene or make a big fuss about it, rather than draw a bunch of attention to what she had just found, this nurse simply swapped out the bags. She didn't say anything about it. She just took the cloudy bag and she passed it off to her superiors for some sort of testing. Frustratingly though, at the time, I don't think that anything really came of it. It was later determined that Linda's IV bag had been tampered with and that someone had injected lidocaine into her IV fluids. But because Linda seemingly was making this miraculous and speedy recovery over the following weeks, I think the contaminated IV bag just kind of got like lost in the shuffle. Don't get me wrong, that is not like a, yeah, what are you gonna do type of occurrence. The fact that this got so easily overlooked is horrifying. The only good thing about it was that at least it was taken note of and there was a paper trail proving that it had happened. Something that, I assure you, will become very, very important later. But for the time being, like I said, Linda was finally seeming to beat whatever had been afflicting her. Things were looking up. She was definitely getting better. And within just a few weeks' time, she was back at home and she was resting and recuperating. And of course, luckily for her, she always had her doting husband by her side, seemingly ready and willing to take care of everything and anything she could possibly need. And this illness and her stint in the hospital, this all almost sort of took Linda's mind off of the issues that she and Paul were having prior to their cruise. You know, I guess almost dying made her feel like her perspective had been flawed, and that, I guess in the light of everything that had gone on since, well, it kind of just seemed like Paul's lies they weren't really worth worrying about anymore, especially given that he had been proving himself to be so loving and so supportive in the wake of Linda's illness. Thankfully though, as far as Linda was concerned, her mystery illness was behind her, and she and her hubby, they could just move past it and they could get on with their lives. Something that made it all the more devastating for Linda when just a few months later, in December 1993, she got sick again. This time, things started with this like horrific metallic taste in Linda's mouth before it then progressed back into like uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, stomach pain, cramping. And once again, no matter what Linda tried at home, she just could not seem to get a handle on whatever this was. And once again, things got so bad that she ended up checking herself into a hospital. This time, Linda checked herself into Mission Hospital, located in Mission Viejo, desperately hoping that these doctors at this hospital would finally be able to figure things out this time. Once again, doctors ran all these tests and they ruled out a bunch of different theories, from hantavirus to radiation poisoning from her job at the power plant. Christ, at one point they theorized that Linda might be poisoning herself in like a desperate ploy for attention. They seemingly looked into everything, but no matter what avenue they chose or what theory they tested, everything just came back with a big fat, I don't fucking know. No one could figure out what the hell could possibly be causing this seemingly healthy woman to suddenly fall so very ill. It was almost a point-by-point replay of Linda's first stint in the hospital. From the tests and the theories and the speculation and the questions, right down to the tampered with IV bag. Yep. That's right. Inexplicably, it happened again. Now, this time alarm bells didn't sound because the liquid was cloudy, like it had been when the first nurse at the first hospital had noticed that something was wrong. But this time it was because one of the like plastic connections in the tubing in the bag, I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but the nurse noticed that it looked like one of these had been messed with, and ultimately it was causing fluid to leak from the bag onto the floor. This second nurse, she did pretty much exactly what the first nurse did. She took the bag down, she replaced it with a fresh new one, and she took the faulty bag off for observation. Upon this further observation, observation and further inspection of the bag and of its connections, hospital staff actually found what appeared to be a small needle prick in one of the IV tubes, which indicated to them that someone had definitely attempted to inject something into Linda Curry's IV. Immediately, hospital staff escalated the situation. They contacted the Orange County Sheriff's Office, who, upon hearing what had happened, came straight out to the site to interview everyone involved. This was serious, and there's actually recordings of all of these conversations, and it is so unbelievably chilling, just downright spine-tingling, bitch, to hear Linda Curry's voice on these tapes point blank say that the only person that she could think would have the means or motive to want her dead would be her very own husband, Paul Curry.
If somebody were trying to do something to you, if they were trying to poison you, any idea who would try to do that?
Well, the only person I could think of that would have a motive to do it would be Paul. And the only motive I can think of is money, but I don't want to really even believe that or think that.
And although she did incriminate him with that statement, with her very next breath, she then goes on to tell police that she doesn't want to believe that he would ever do something like that to her. She thought that he truly loved her, and she could not let herself believe that he would ever genuinely try to harm her in any way. And the DA that eventually ended up trying this case, I think he summed this up perfectly in stating that Linda almost sounds like she's trying to convince herself that Paul could not be the one responsible for this, rather than trying to convince the detectives. It's like, she's right there. Like, she almost has it. But then at the very last second, she pulls back and she refuses to see what is so clearly right in front of her. And I do not mean that in a judgmental way. Not at all. I don't think that I could ever try to wrap my head around something like that. To come to terms with the fact that the person who is supposed to love you and supposed to protect you, that person is actually trying to kill you, it probably really did seem far-fetched to her to think that that was what was going on. And it is just so frustrating because even if Linda was way too close to the picture to see what was truly going on, from an outside perspective, it just seems so glaringly obvious. So the fact that police really couldn't prove anything before Linda ended up being discharged, it's really, really frustrating, and it's very disheartening. Now, meanwhile, while Linda had been in the hospital and speaking to police and all that jazz, her friend Mary had actually been staying at her house so that she could be nearby the hospital in case Linda or Paul ended up needing anything. But even though they were in this limbo period and they didn't really know what to expect, I still don't think that anything could have possibly prepared Mary for what she ended up stumbling across while she was staying at the Currys. So it's getting late one night. Mary and her husband, they're ready to hit the hay. So Mary heads upstairs to get herself ready for bed. She's heading towards the bathroom. She's walking upstairs, walking past Linda and Paul's room, when all of a sudden, out of the corner of her eye, something stops her dead in her tracks. You see, strewn all across one of Paul and Linda's bedroom dressers was this massive pile of papers. Okay? And although Mary knew deep down, this isn't really my place, this isn't my house, this really isn't my business, for some reason, she just had this visceral, uncontrollable pull from within her. Something telling her, Mary, you have to look at those papers. And so she did. And what she saw terrified her to her very core. This wasn't just any normal pile of papers. No. This was essentially documentation of every single monetary asset that Linda had in her name. We're talking life insurance, retirement, mortgage, investments, bank statements, you name it. If it had some sort of monetary value, the documentation of it was sitting right there. And in looking over these documents, it very quickly became clear to Mary that if Linda were to pass, Paul was looking at a pretty hefty payday, upwards of $1 million to be exact. And that is when the reality of the situation hit Mary like a fucking bus. All of a sudden, she felt like she knew exactly what had been making her friend so sick. And it just so happened to be the man that her friend blindly loved and blindly trusted. Her very own husband, Paul Curry. And while Mary couldn't be sure exactly how Paul was doing what she believed that he was doing, she did instantly have the thought that it might have something to do with all of these extravagant and elaborate meals that Paul was always cooking for Linda. Specifically, it is mentioned time after time after time in this case that Paul was always experimenting with salad dressings and sauces. He was like a bootleg Paul Newman. It's crazy that both their names are Paul. Anyway, what Mary was now wondering was, is he poisoning all of these sauces and these dressings and these meals that he's putting together for her? If not that, was he putting something in these baths that he was drawing for her every night? Were all of these things that Paul was doing for Linda, all of these things that had initially made her friends jealous, was all this just one long con, one long ruse to get Linda out of the way so that he could cash in on her death? Well, at this point, Mary definitely thought so. And so, when Linda was discharged from the hospital the second time and she came back home, Mary wasted no time in discussing her theories and her fears with her friend. These women had been going on 20 years of friendship at this point. So if anyone could get through to Linda, it would have been Mary. And actually, at first, Linda seemed really open to hearing and to listening to what Mary had to say. Like, it was almost as if she too was starting to see the light. And briefly, Mary genuinely and truly thought that she had likely just saved her best friend's life. However, within just a couple of days, Linda completely changed her tune. She once again started telling Mary that she loved Paul and that he loved her and that she simply just could not leave him. Words that were absolutely crushing and devastating for Mary to hear. Here she thought she had saved her friend's life, only to then find out that Linda was going to stay with this man that Mary just knew deep down in her gut was trying to kill her. And so, as difficult as I assume it was for both Mary and Linda, this actually kind of began a period of separation in their friendship. Don't get me wrong, they were definitely still friends, but this whole ordeal, it really put some distance in between them. Because from Mary's perspective, Linda is discounting this gut feeling that she has, and she's choosing to stay with this man who very well might be trying to kill her. But then from Linda's perspective, Mary is accusing the man that she loves of just the worst possible thing that a person could ever imagine. They both ended up feeling as though they needed space from one another to try to reconcile their own feelings and their own issues before their friendship could truly ever really go back to the way that it had once been. Devastatingly though, they would actually never get the chance to see their friendship bounce back. Just 2 months after this conversation, Mary would get the news that she had been dreading all this time. June 9th, 1994. Mary received an email from none other than Paul himself. And the contents of this email, they were Mary's absolute worst nightmare. Paul was writing to tell her that Linda had seemingly taken a turn for the worst. Evidently, she was incoherent, she was rambling, she wasn't making any sense, she couldn't walk straight, she could barely even stand up. I mean, according to Paul, this was the worst condition that Linda had been in up to this point. And after reading that email, Mary just knew that there was no way Linda was going to come back from this for a third time. And unfortunately, she was right. According to Paul, Linda had arrived home from work on the evening of June 10th, 1992, right around 6 p.m. Obviously, we know that she hadn't been feeling her best, so rather than eat dinner or to take care of anything like around the house, Linda instead just opted to go straight upstairs and go straight to bed. And then it was around 11 p.m. when Paul then went to bed. And supposedly that is when Paul found Linda pallid, cold, and unresponsive. According to Paul, he immediately called 911 and began CPR until paramedics and first responders arrived. Linda was immediately loaded into an ambulance and she was rushed to the nearest hospital. However, despite the quick response and the life-saving efforts made by everyone involved, Linda Lee Curry was ultimately declared dead in the ambulance before she ever even made it to the hospital. She was only 50 years old. Just completely devastating. Now, given the lead up to Linda's death, police were notified. There was an investigation surrounding the circumstances. Paul was questioned, an autopsy was performed. However, despite seeming so unbelievably obvious to us now in hindsight, at the time, police simply did not have enough evidence to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Paul had, in fact, caused Linda's death. Of course, they had a lot of circumstantial evidence, the suspicious IV bags, the suspicion cast by Linda's friends and family, the suspicion cast by Linda herself. The problem was that given the limitations at the time, because remember, it's only the early 1990s at this point, it just was not within their capabilities at the time to prove Paul's responsibility with what they had. He was certainly always considered a suspect. In fact, I'm fairly certain he was the only suspect or the only person of interest that police ever really pursued. But because they weren't able to immediately determine Linda's cause of death, there really wasn't even any way to definitively say that Linda had been murdered, even though pretty much everyone that she knew believed that she had. The only finding that came out of Linda's autopsy that was out of the ordinary was, quote, hemorrhaging consistent with a needle puncture discovered behind her right ear. Which, sounds incredibly suspicious. But given the fact that there was nothing on Linda's toxicology report that had come back strong enough to indicate that she'd been poisoned, police were kind of just left at a standstill. Now, that's not to say that nothing had popped on Linda's tox screen, but do me a favor and put a pin in that for a second, if you don't mind. For the time being, Linda was laid to rest in Pacific View Memorial Park, located in Corona del Mar, pretty much as soon as her body was released back to Paul. He wasted absolutely no time in trying to get his wife in the ground as fast as humanly possible, something that definitely rubbed Linda's family and friends the wrong way. Specifically, Linda's older sister Paht, she found a lot of things troubling about the way that Paul had chosen to handle honoring his wife. Now, Paul claims that all of the decisions that he made regarding Linda's memorial service, as well as regarding her burial, those to him were all typical customs rooted in Jewish faith. Closed casket, no postmortem manipulations, no hairstyles, cosmetics, no embalming. All things that are typically customary within the Jewish faith. The problem with that, though, Linda wasn't Jewish. According to her friends and family, this was in no way, shape, or form the way that Linda would have wanted her funeral or her burial to go. Linda would have wanted her friends and family to have been able to see her one last time and to say their final goodbyes. And more importantly, she would have wanted to look damn good for the process. But Paul simply did not care about that fact. And contrary to what he claimed, I don't think that it had squat to do with religion, whether he was truly practicing in his faith or not. I think the main objective in Paul treating Linda's body the way that he did was in getting her in the ground and decomposing as fast as humanly possible. I know that sounds crass, and I truly am sorry for that, but I think the faster that he could get rid of Linda's body, the less likely he thought police would be to ever figure out what he had done. And what really and truly just fucking makes my ass itch when it comes to this man is that, like, he knew he was suspect numero uno when it came to Linda's death, right? And he didn't care. He never cared about being questioned. He didn't care about being a suspect. He never cared about an interview. This man was so arrogant and so full of himself that he truly believed that he was so much smarter than everyone around him. He figured that it didn't matter if he was a suspect or not, because he thought that he had covered his tracks so well that no one would ever be able to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was guilty. And what is beyond frustrating is that for the next 10 years, it truly seemed as though he was right. Paul went on to collect Linda's death benefits. I don't think he got his hands on all of it because she had actually switched the beneficiary on some of her policies from Paul to her sister. But overall, I think he was still able to collect like $500,000 in blood money, something that really came in handy for him when he ended up being forced to resign from San Onofre. Don't worry, we'll circle back to that. But yeah, Paul left the plant. He let Linda's home go into foreclosure, and ultimately, he left California altogether. Initially, he relocated to Vegas, where he took a job as a used car salesman, before he ultimately relocated again to Kansas, where he took a job working as a building inspector. And in hearing this, you might think like, wow, from nuclear engineer to used car salesman? How the mighty have fallen, am I right? Well, as it would turn out, Paul was never really as high and mighty as he would have liked people to believe. All he ever was really good at making people believe that he was. However, that whole charade came crumbling down around him when he was up for a transfer at San Onofre, prompting them to run a routine background check. And y'all, I don't know how they missed this the first time around when he initially got the job in the first place, but this second time around, somehow they found out that Paul had completely fabricated all of the qualifications that he had claimed to have in order to secure this job. He had no experience in the field. He didn't have a degree in the field. He never even graduated college at all. Yet somehow he was able to completely dupe this billion-dollar energy company into believing that he was this character that he'd created. Paul, the nuclear engineer. It was all bullshit. And they had bought right into it. But now, obviously knowing the truth, they could not allow Paul to stay employed there anymore, especially not in charge of safety protocols. The fact that he had worked there all these years and not had any issues with his lack of experience is just, they're so lucky. Ultimately, he was given the option to either be fired or to resign and to head out with his tail between his legs. And of course, as I implied moments earlier, Paul and his big stupid nose, they chose the latter option and they just abandoned California in general. Meanwhile, while he's ping-ponging around the country and trying to rebrand himself and create a new life, back in California, someone Paul had never even met was on the precipice of completely destroying him. Something that makes me very, very happy. It was 2002, so almost 10 years after Linda's death, that Orange County Sheriff's Department Cold Case Sergeant Yvonne Shull first laid her eyes on Paul's case file. Out of 113 unsolved cases that Sergeant Shull could have picked up, Linda's case happened to be the one that she couldn't ignore. And this was for numerous reasons, but mostly it was because all of her colleagues had deemed this case as unsolvable. Basically, they told Yvonne that, yeah, her husband did it, but you'll never be able to prove it. To which Yvonne was like, bitch, bet. And then she proceeded to make solving Linda's case the most important goal of her entire career up to that point. She started this crusade, I assume where any detective in her situation would have. She started by looking through Linda's case file and by listening to all of the interviews that police had recorded during the initial investigation. And I'm not even talking Linda's death investigation. I'm talking like the investigation into all of her illnesses before she died. Sergeant Shull was in an incredibly unique position where she could actually listen to her murder victim say from her own mouth very incriminating stuff regarding her prime suspect. It was almost as if Linda was speaking to Sergeant Shull from beyond the grave. Definitely something that most homicide detectives do not have going into like your typical cold case. And this was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to things that were unique about this case. Looking into Paul's past and trying to create an image of who this man truly was, well, it was proving incredibly difficult for Sergeant Shull because, as we know, Paul's a big fat liar. We know he lied to Linda about never being married. He lied to her about not having kids. We know he lied to San Onofre about having any skills or any education that would qualify him for his position there. Now, personally, I could have told you by the size of that man's nose that every word out of his mouth was bullshit.
Perhaps you haven't been telling the truth, Pinocchio.
However, Sergeant Shull, she had to find that out the hard way. She dug through Paul's past as far back as she possibly could, looking for any sort of relevant red flags or patterns that perhaps the detectives had missed on the initial go-round. And lo and behold, in speaking with one of Paul's exes, Miss Yvonne found just that. So initially, Paul was married to a woman named Deborah. She's the woman that he had had children with that accidentally blew up his spot with Linda when she'd called looking for alimony money. Then it was after that marriage went to shit that Paul ended up marrying a different woman named Leslie. And it was in speaking to Leslie that some very eerie similarities between Linda and Paul's marriage and her and Paul's marriage started to come to light. Evidently, shortly into Leslie and Paul's marriage, she too fell mysteriously ill. She was struck down with vertigo and nausea and fatigue of an unknown origin. And much like with Linda, this sickness went on with Leslie for over a year. But don't worry, because in the event of a potential tragedy, Paul was prepared. Just like he had with Linda, he had requested that Leslie go and get a life insurance policy, something that she did agree to do. And had things not played out the way that they did, I can sit here and say to you with confidence that I don't believe that Leslie would be alive today. Thankfully, though, her application for this policy was denied, and Paul actually ended up leaving her just weeks after this. Like, he didn't even try to make it not obvious. But while I'm sure that it was difficult for Leslie at the time that her husband had just up and left her for God knows if he even gave her a reason. In hindsight, though, it is very likely that, like I said, this chain of events probably saved this woman's life. Unfortunately, though, we know that Linda would not be so lucky. And all this conversation with Leslie, this really got Sergeant Scholl thinking. Leslie, at this time, was a healthy young woman, so why would a company deny her life insurance? Well, as it would turn out, the most common reason for people to be denied this type of coverage is, quote, misrepresentations or non-disclosure of information on the application. And the most common thing that people lie about? Being non-smokers, when in actuality, they're just wolfing down cigarettes like Estelle from Friends.
Yeah, hi. Lori, please.
So people check non-smoker on these applications thinking that like they're going to cheat the system, but then they get their blood drawn and their nicotine levels give them away, and the insurance company then drops them like a hot pile of trash. And in like casually wondering if maybe that was what had happened with Leslie, all of a sudden, Sergeant Scholl remembered something very interesting from Linda's postmortem toxicology screening. You see, Linda had actually tested positive for nicotine in her blood following her death. However, in reviewing Linda's medical records, Yvonne couldn't find even a shred of evidence that Linda had ever been a smoker. Conversely, Linda actually seemed like she was incredibly health conscious, so it was weird to think that she would have ever made the decision to smoke at any point. And so, following this incredibly shrewd observation and this spot-on hunch, Yvonne began really looking into this. Blood tests and chemical detection, toxicology testing, it had come a long way in the 8 years since Linda's death. So looking into her test results now, they were able to determine so much more in 2002 than they could have ever been able to deduce back in 94. And after consulting with one of the country's leading nicotine experts, it was ultimately determined that the concentration of nicotine that was in Linda's blood, it was 4 to 5 times higher than any level they had ever seen in any human ever before, meaning that there was simply no way that Linda had ingested that much nicotine by choice, let alone through any sort of typical use. And in turn, this definitely made the potential needle prick that had been discovered behind Linda's ear during her autopsy all the more suspicious and all the more concerning. Not to mention that also in reviewing Linda's autopsy with fresh eyes, it was discovered that she had more Ambien in her system than what's typically found from traditional therapeutic use. And I think they initially overlooked this too because her levels weren't like life-threateningly high or anything like that. I think they were just somewhat elevated from what a typical reading might be. So as an isolated factor, they didn't really put too much stock in it. But as Sergeant Scholl was putting all of these things together, these crazy high nicotine levels, the sneaky little injection site, the Ambien, it was all starting to come together to paint a very disturbing yet highly anticipated picture. This sleazeball, Paul Curry, had murdered his wife, and now they finally had enough to prove it. Based on Dr. Benoit's expertise, the nicotine expert, Linda would have likely died within 20 to 30 minutes of receiving that fatal nicotine injection. And by Paul's own statements back in 94, he and Linda were the only two people that had been in their house at any point the night she died. So operating under the knowledge that Linda obviously didn't do this to herself, that really only left one other responsible party.
Paul, is it?
The only problem that still remained was the fact that Paul, I hate to say it, but he was smart. He may not have actually been a nuclear engineer, but that didn't mean he was dumb. They knew that if he even caught a whiff of what they were trying to insinuate, that he would manage to come up with some sort of explanation that could perhaps introduce some sort of reasonable doubt within a jury. So basically what they wanted to do was to have Paul reconfirm with them all these years later with certainty that he was definitely the only person in the home with Linda in the hours leading up to her death. More or less, they wanted him to use his own story to paint himself into a corner that they could then combine with the facts that they had now. And, oh, silly, stupid, arrogant little Paul, he played right into Sergeant Scholl's hand. Posing as a local officer from Kansas, Sergeant Scholl set up a meeting with Paul under the guise that Orange County had asked her to conduct like a final interview before they were going to officially close Linda's case. And hearing this, thinking that like, one, Linda's case was about to be closed, which would have been great for him, and two, that these officers weren't really well versed on his case, so that there wasn't really any risk in him sitting down and in talking with them, Paul, like a dumbass, agreed. He came in on his own volition, and he agreed to sit down and to speak to police 100% sans legal representation. And I think throughout the course of his interview, Sergeant Scholl gets Paul to say like 4 or 5 times in 4 or 5 different ways that he was unequivocally, without a doubt, the only person with Linda on the night of her death. And y'all, you should have seen the look on Paul's face when Sergeant Scholl told him that she was actually here from Orange County and she was arresting him for Linda's murder. This jackass, for fucking real, asked if he was going to be able to make a 4 o'clock meeting at his job that day.
Should I presume that I'm not going to make my 4 o'clock meeting today?
Yes.
Why is that?
I don't know how long this is going to take.
Well, what is this that is taking? Does this trump my obligation to my employer? It's going to be awfully hard to explain professionally.
Baby, you're going to prison. You don't have a job anymore. Of course, Paul pled not guilty to his charges. Even with damn near all of the cards stacked against this guy, he truly and genuinely believed that if he could weave together a good enough story, that he could somehow still get away with this. Truly, if he wasn't such an unbelievable jackass, I would almost find his confidence impressive. Keyword, almost, because the story that he and his lawyer did end up coming up with to, try to explain away Linda's death, it was absolute dog water. Paul went to trial in 2014. Honestly, I don't know what took them so long because homeboy was arrested in 2002, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that in an effort to refute his murder charges, Paul's attorney suggested that Linda may have died accidentally by giving herself a nicotine enema. A nicotine enema. A nicotine enema. Bitch, what? I've heard of coffee enemas. I've heard of barium enemas. According to Google, there's water enemas, saline enemas, Epsom salt enemas, baking soda, sodium phosphate, glycerin. There's no shortage of different types of enemas, apparently. But never in all my 32 years of life have I ever heard of a single person having a nicotine enema. Evidently, Paul's team tried to bolster this theory by citing Linda's numerous different physical ailments and then pairing that with the fact that she was apparently interested in homeopathic medicine. A nicotine enema. Not necessarily the murder defense that I'd go with, but I mean, I'll give them points for creativity because I don't think we're going to hear this one again. Now, playing devil's advocate, apparently nicotine enemas are a real thing. I mean, I suppose that any kind of enema is a thing if you try hard enough. All jokes aside, though, nicotine enemas are real. Evidently, they are potentially beneficial for conditions like constipation. Some studies even suggest that they could help with Crohn's disease or with ulcerative colitis. But even taking that into consideration, I would still assume that these would need to be done under heavy supervision from like a healthcare provider. But even taking that a step further and operating under the assumption that Linda had decided to go rogue and to administer this nicotine enema on herself, I have to imagine that there would have been some sort of physical indications discovered during her autopsy that would have helped to lend credence to this theory. According to Google, improperly administered enemas can cause a few different types of trauma back there. These include perforation and or chemical irritation, 2 things that, to my knowledge, were not indicated on Linda's autopsy. They found nothing out of the ordinary during her postmortem exam, save for that pesky little needle prick they found behind her ear. And honestly, thank God that they found that. And thank God that the medical examiner took the time and the care to see it and to note it down, because without that literal pin prick of evidence, Who knows if or when police could have ever parlayed their suspicion towards Paul into an actual case against him. Throughout the trial, the theory put forward to the jury by the prosecution was that Paul never truly loved Linda. Linda may have loved Paul, but Paul simply saw dollar signs, where Linda believed that she had truly found the love of her life and that she had found her soulmate. Paul never loved or honored or cherished Linda. Instead, he simply bided his time until Linda was worth more to him dead than she was alive. And that is when he put his horrific and disgusting plan into motion. According to detectives, as well as to prosecuting attorney Brahim Beytai, Paul had initially tried to poison Linda slowly. He didn't initially want to take her out in one fell swoop because he didn't want to end up sitting exactly where he was, fighting for his freedom against literal murder charges. Paul figured that if he could poison Linda slowly, it might present in a manner that could potentially be written off as natural illness, and then he'd be in the clear. The only problem with that, though, was that Linda, she wasn't dying fast enough for Paul. Every time she started going downhill, obviously we know she ended up in the hospital, where despite his best efforts, he could no longer keep poisoning her without raising red flags. So, enter Plan B. On the night that Linda died, Paul allegedly subdued his wife with Ambien before then injecting her with a fatal dose of nicotine. Apparently, all it would have taken to extract enough nicotine to kill Linda would have been either one pack of cigarettes or a single cigar. Of course, he likely assumed that the injection site would never be noticed and that he'd just ride off scot-free into the sunset with his late wife's money. Thankfully, though, that obviously was not how things ended up playing out. And finally, 2 decades after he murdered Linda, on September 30th, 2014, after 7,416 days of freedom that he did not deserve, as well as 1 additional day for jury deliberations, Paul Curry was finally found guilty of insurance fraud, as well as first-degree murder committed for financial gain, the latter of which carries a mandatory life sentence with absolutely no possibility of parole. And in my opinion, that is exactly what that man deserves. Oh, and not only is this spineless, dickless worm locked away, but his wife left his ass, his friends all turned their backs on him, and of course, now we all know that he's not a genius. He's not a rocket scientist, he's not a nuclear engineer, he's just a regular, run-of-the-mill loser who simply couldn't stand to see a woman doing better than he was. He was so jealous and so emasculated and threatened by Linda's money and her success that he married her and killed her in her very own home, just so that he could attempt to absorb a smidgen of what Linda had accomplished in her life. He is such a fucking loser. Paul did try to appeal his conviction in 2017 on the grounds that the trial had erred in denying his motion to dismiss due to pre-charging delay. I don't know, just a bunch of legal jargon bullshit. He also challenged the admission of various statements made by Linda, and he had some sort of whiny complaint about something to do with jury selection. I don't know. Sorry, it was a lot of big legal words, and frankly, I personally don't care to look into it because it was all denied. His appeals and his post-conviction tantrums, they all went nowhere. So what does that mean? Well, it means that Paul Marshall Curry continues to rot behind bars in Valley State Prison to this day. He's currently 68 years old, and I hope to God that he is just having not a good time serving out that fat, juicy, wet life sentence. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to poor Linda. To have your life taken from you by someone who was supposed to love you and to value you, to cherish and protect you. Oh, it is just a horrific and gut-wrenching thought. I can barely even wrap my head around it. Sure, Linda may have been older than Paul, but she had so much life left to live, and undoubtedly she would have contributed far more to society and to the world than Paul ever could have dreamed to have contributed. She was such a light. She was such a kind and a caring person, and I just know that her loss is one that those who knew and loved her, it has to be something that they are going to struggle with every single day for the rest of their own lives. Sure, they've received their justice as far as the courts are concerned, but nothing can ever bring Linda back. Nothing can ever take away the 20 years of freedom that Paul got before he was finally held accountable. So yeah, they've had their day in court and they've received their justice, but I still just hope that the people who knew her and loved her are able to someday find peace, knowing that hopefully Paul never can and never will hurt anyone ever again. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked down in the description. And one more big thank you goes out to Oz for requesting this video and for requesting this super cute Lisa Frank inspired makeup look. Speaking of, if by chance you are interested in anything about today's makeup, I will make sure to have all of the links and the information for the products I used today listed down in the description box for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. That is changing very shortly here to weekly, but for now, the date of my next video is on the screen for you here. That said though, if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! Will serve as the stunning backdrop from her blouses to her shoes. Linda's career began when she accepted an for a nuclear generating station. Whoa, that's a mouthful. At Southern California. Nope. Throughout her time working at San Onofre. Oh my God. Throughout her time working at San Onofre. Jesus. That was a little much. Anything, because she did. Yeah, Ted? Who the fuck is Ted? Blood tests and chemical detection and cosmetology. With Linda in the hours leading up to her own death. Oh.